Peter Schiff was right. That was the name of the YouTube video that has been viewed nearly 1.3 million times since the market mayhem last September. And that video is only one of many excerpts from Mr. Schiff. The view totals for Mr. Schiff on YouTube are therefore clearly higher, much higher than 1.3 million. So what has been the source of this massive public interest? For years, Peter Schiff has been appearing on radio and television, on CNBC, CNN, Fox News, Fox Business Network, Bloomberg, and many other networks. And in these appearances, he continually expresses a message critical of America's economy based on borrowing and spending rather than on saving and production. His message is equally critical of the political policies that led to that kind of economy. As you can see in the YouTube video, Schiff was often derided, dismissed, or ridiculed about these views, until his predictions started, one by one, to come true. Schiff, a licensed broker with more than 20 years of experience, is the head of Euro-Pacific Capital. Wiley & Sons published his best-selling book, Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, in 2007. His new book, which some of you have now, The Little Book of Bull Moves in Bear Markets, How to Keep Your Portfolio Up When the Market is Down, came out with the same publisher this past fall. The new book has pursued a similar course to the top of bestseller charts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a man with a penetrating and controversial message about the state of the world today, Peter Schiff.
This is the book, if you haven't seen it. Crash Proof. I'm actually in the process of revising the book now, and Crash Proof 2.0 is going to be coming out, I think, in October. But the change, we dropped the coming from the title. So instead of how to profit from the coming economic collapse, it's going to be how to profit from the economic collapse. Because it's obviously no longer coming, it's here. But, the real thing is the economic collapse that I envisioned in this book is just getting started. I mean, it's not over. A lot of people think that this is it, that this is what I was predicting. This isn't what I was predicting. This is basically the start. The premise of this book was that we were living in a bubble economy. We had a phony economy that was based on spending borrowed money. We were borrowing money from the world because the world saved and we didn't, and then we used that borrowed money to buy products that they produced. We also used the money to build houses and remodel houses, and Wall Street used the money for all sorts of speculations. But the bottom line is we weren't being productive. We were living in an illusion. And as we spent money and we kept counting that spending in our GDP, we deluded ourselves into thinking we had economic growth because an economist pointed to an expanding GDP. Meanwhile, we ignored the fact that that growth was increasingly comprised of spending money. And we ignored the fact that we were going into debt to spend that money. And no one seemed to care about all the liabilities that we were accumulating because they were blinded by real estate equity or stock market valuations. And people thought, well, the debt is manageable because look at all these assets. Well, the assets were an illusion. There wasn't any real value there. Our stocks were not being valued based on the dividends they paid. Our real estate wasn't being valued based on the rents it threw off. So we had no real income on the assets to service the debts. The only way we can service the debts is if we could sell the assets. But the minute we try to sell the assets, the price implodes. And the problem with the debt is the debt doesn't go away. When the asset prices go down, the debt doesn't go down. The debt's still there until we default on it. Meanwhile, the debt has to be serviced. We have to pay interest in our debt. We're not getting income on the assets, but we have to pay our creditors interest on the debt. And the problem was, and I certainly saw that when I was writing the book, that a lot of the debt was floating rate. A lot of the mortgage debt had teaser rates, where initially for the first few years you get a low payment. But then what happens after the teaser rate expires? You have to make much higher payments. So we were judging the manageability of the debt based on the teaser rates. We weren't factoring in what happens. I mean, everybody knows a lot of times you can subscribe to cable television and they'll give you, 3 months free. But obviously at some point, the real rate kicks in. Well, we were trying to base our ability to handle our debts based on the fact that we can afford the teaser rates. So I knew that there was going to be a major collapse coming. But what's really happened is the bubble has been pricked. We simply found a pin that I knew was out there, and I described the pin as the bursting of the housing bubble. I thought that was the most likely event that would set the events in motion for the economic collapse, because that would expose the fallacy of the economy. But the real crash and the economic collapse that I envisioned was going to be how the government was going to respond to the developing crisis. What my fear was is that the bubble would burst, the real estate market would burst, debts would be exposed, banks would fail, lenders would go broke, the economy would go into a severe recession, a lot of Americans would lose their jobs. The fact is, a lot of jobs were the direct result of the excess spending that went along with the real estate boom. When Americans had home equity, they felt rich, and so they went out and they bought stuff. And when Americans were using their teaser rates, they took the difference between what the rate would normally be and their subsidized rate, and they went out and spent the money. And of course, a lot of Americans were able to extract home equity, and they were able to spend that money. So you had a phony economy based on everybody spending money they really didn't have. And I knew that when the spending stopped, the economy would contract, and all the jobs that were associated with that, all the cars that we bought that we couldn't afford, and the houses that we were remodeling, all the credit cards, all these jobs would have to go away because they really weren't viable to begin with. So I thought this process would begin. Now, what we have to understand is the recession, right? This unwinding of this credit bubble is the cure, right? The disease was the fact that we were borrowing and spending all the money in the first place. That was the problem. This is the solution. It's painful. It's not fun when you have to correct the imbalances. Coming off of a hangover, if you're all drunk and now you're hungover, that process isn't fun. But that's what happens when you're going to get normal. And we were all drugged up on cheap credit. We did a lot of crazy things, right? George Bush pointed out that Wall Street got drunk, and yeah, they were drunk. Main Street was drunk. The whole country was drunk. But they were drunk on the cheap money supplied by the Fed. I mean, the Fed was the bartender. The Fed liquored everybody up. And so we did a lot of stupid things. Wall Street did a lot of things that they never would have done if they were sober. Same thing with Main Street. The government came in and made risk-taking riskless. They took the risk out of risk-taking. It was just profits. The money was cheap. It was easy to speculate. It were one-way bets. And if your bets went wrong, don't worry. The Fed had your back. Greenspan put, too big to fail, all sorts of moral hazards. Don't lend money to people to buy houses. Doesn't matter if they can't pay. Fannie and Freddie are guaranteeing the debt. They're backed by the government. Don't worry. So we had the bubble, and it's burst. But what I predicted, that the real economic crisis would be because of what the government was going to do to reflate the bubble. And this is where I see the lion's share of the problems, and they're still in our future. And in fact, the government is even surprising me with what it's able to do. When I first wrote this book, and I was trying to think of all the ways the government would try to artificially stimulate the economy, I couldn't even come up with all the stuff that they've actually done. They've actually surprised me by what they've done. And therefore, I think the collapse could be even worse. I mean, when I wrote the book, hyperinflation was kind of the worst case scenario. I didn't think it was the most likely scenario. I thought it was a possibility. I thought it was remote, but I thought there was a good chance of it, and I wrote about it. Now I think that hyperinflation might be the most likely scenario. It doesn't mean it's 100% guaranteed, but it's likely. Because the problem is, and the way I wrote in the book, so we'd have this bubble economy, it would burst, and then the government would try to blow it back up. The government would try to put air back into the bubble. Because that's the way we always have reacted in the past. That's the way Greenspan ran the Fed. Every time the economy started to contract, they intervened. They increased money supply. They slashed interest rates. They stimulated the economy. And so we never really got a full recession. We never really got to correct the imbalances of the boom because we simply piled on more imbalances, and we kept sweeping the problems under the rug or kicking the can down the road. But I saw that this latest bubble that the Fed had created was going to be so huge and so enormous that there was no way to stimulate our way out of it. When George Bush when George W. came into office, he came into a situation similar, just not as bad, as Barack Obama. He inherited the bursting of the NASDAQ bubble, and he inherited a recession. And, the recession would have been compounded by September 11th. So we should have had a pretty severe recession. We had to deal with the terrorist attacks. We had to deal with that loss. We had to deal with the cost of the war on terror and of securing our borders. And we had to deal with the bursting of the NASDAQ bubble, where a lot of malinvestments were made. A lot of companies were started in the 1990s that never should have been started. A lot of people were employed at companies that couldn't make profits, and therefore those companies needed to go bankrupt, and therefore those people needed to lose their jobs. A lot of people made investment decisions, made spending decisions based on stock options that really didn't pan out, but people thought that they would. So we made a lot of foolish choices. And again, the reason that we were so foolish is because the Fed was too easy during the 1990s. Greenspan blew up the stock market bubble. It's because of the Greenspan Fed that the NASDAQ went to 5,000, that we made all these foolish investments in the first place. But when that bubble burst and George Bush came in, we should have had a very severe recession. But we didn't, because the Fed did what it always does. Greenspan did what he had done in the past. They slashed interest rates down to 1%. Now they're 0, but they went down to 1. And what did Bush do? Stimulus, right? He cut spending, he increased government spending and cut taxes and ran up the deficit. Ran it up from, the small surplus that we had on paper up to what, $500 billion, $300 billion deficits. But that was a standard Keynesian remedy, stimulate the economy, prime the pump. And the recession was very narrow. We barely had a recession. We had 2 quarters maybe of negative growth. But in that recession, we had record car sales and record home sales. And of course, now we're suffering from that because people were buying homes they shouldn't have bought. They borrowed money they couldn't repay. We bought too many cars during that recession. We shouldn't have bought all those cars. We couldn't afford them. But we artificially pumped up the economy, and we got the housing bubble. Now that bubble is burst, and we have trillions and trillions of dollars of additional debt that we wouldn't have had if we had had a more severe recession in 2001, 2002, now we have to deal with the consequences of the Greenspan-Bush stimulus packages. And the Bernanke-Obama package is even worse. Now, like I said, we got interest rates at 0. Look at all the damage we did with 1%. How much more are we doing at 0? And the Obama budget deficits, they dwarf anything that Bush had. It's ironic that Obama is now trying to criticize Bush for running up the deficit, as he's running it up through the roof, $2 trillion in his first term. And he's saying, well, I'm going to cut it in half by my last year. Well, even if he's right, it's still going to be $1 trillion when he cuts it in half. It's still more than twice the last budget deficit from Bush. But I don't even think he's going to succeed. I think the deficit could be even bigger than $2 trillion in his last term. But so my point is that when that bubble burst, that the government would do the same thing that Bush did. And that's exactly what Obama's doing. He's doing nothing different from Bush. He campaigned and he ran on a platform of change, but he hasn't changed anything. He's doing the same thing that Bush did, only he's just doing it on a bigger scale. He's making the same mistakes, only he's making them bigger. And so we're not going to have a different result. We're going to have a worse result. And so my fear was that when the bubble would burst, the steps that the government would take to try to reflate the bubble would ultimately destroy the dollar, that the dollar would collapse, and that would send inflation in the United States, or consumer prices and interest rates, straight up. And that's what's coming. And then what we're going to have is a recession, right? A very weak economy, but at the same time, we're going to have high inflation and high interest rates. It's going to be kind of like the stagflation of the 1970s, only much worse, because it's not going to be stagnation. It's going to be outright contraction, like we had in the 1930s, but with inflation much higher than it was in the 1970s. During the 1930s, when we had the Great Depression, which, we're probably going to have to come up with a new name for that at some point. But we had that Great Depression, consumer prices fell, right? The cost of living went down. Money became more valuable. We were on a gold standard back then. So even though your stocks went down and maybe you lost a little money in the bank, your cost of living went down. In fact, if you didn't have money in the stock market and you didn't lose your job, the 1930s was a pretty prosperous time for you, right? Because if you had a job, things were cheaper. You could buy assets, you could buy houses cheaper, cars cheaper, appliances. Cost of living went down. We were on a gold standard back then. We don't have that discipline now. In addition, when the Depression first started, the government was small. The federal government barely did anything. And therefore, Roosevelt was able to increase the size of government because the government was already tiny. That's not what the situation is today. The government is already enormous, and Barack Obama wants to make it even bigger. And we're broke. We didn't have all this debt in the 1930s. We had a sound economy. We had a bubble. The Federal Reserve blew up a bubble in the 1920s for the same reason they blew one up this time around. Monetary policy was too easy. They kept interest rates too low, and we had a stock market bubble. The bubble burst. And Herbert Hoover, rather than allowing the recession to run its course, which we had done in the past every time we had a boom and bust, and of course, if you go back in history, all the booms have their roots with a monetary expansion. And then there's a contraction and there's a bust. Rather than allowing the market to function, Hoover decided that he was going to intervene, that he knew better. He was going to bail out companies. He was going to stimulate the economy. That might not have been the words they used, but it was the same concepts. He wasn't going to let the market reset prices. The government was going to interfere. The government was going to try to determine prices and try to determine wages. They tried to prop prices up and prevent them from falling and keep companies in business that would have gone bankrupt. And so Hoover, with those interventionist policies, very similar to the Bush policies, he created the Great Depression. He got it started. And then Roosevelt came in with the New Deal and made the Depression worse, made it great, and made it last all the way through the Second World War. But the politicians today would have us believe that Roosevelt saved the day, that it was the free market policies of Hoover, it was capitalism, unbridled capitalism, that created the Depression, and it was socialism in the form of the New Deal that got us out of it. When, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. There never would have been a Great Depression if we had relied on free market forces. We created that ourselves. That's exactly what we're doing now, but the problem is we're doing it from a much more vulnerable position. We no longer have the industrial economy that we had back then. We're in debt. Our industry is basically gone. We still have some, but we don't have nothing like what we used to have. We have a nation built on spending borrowed money, and we owe the world trillions. And now, we just had this G20 meeting, and there was a lot of publicity coming up to it because, China's over there and other countries who are financing all of our stimulus plans and our bailouts. They're the ones that are having to pick up the tab, right? They're the ones that we're asking to pay for all this. And I think they're not going to want to do it. We think we've got China over a barrel because, we owe them $1 trillion. We think that they have no choice, that they have to keep lending us money. Well, they do have a choice, especially when we're asking them to lend us trillions more. It's pretty clear if the Chinese are worried about taking a loss on $1 trillion, why do they want to compound their problem by owning $2 trillion or $3 trillion or $4 trillion, which is what they're going to have to do because they're the ones with the surpluses. They're the ones that are loaning us the money. And, Hillary Clinton was just over there a couple of weeks ago, trying to convince the Chinese that we're all in this together, that they have to lend us this money so that we can spend it and so that their people can have jobs. And this is all nonsense. What good is it doing the Chinese to have jobs when we get all their stuff? The whole point of jobs is so you can have stuff. Hillary Clinton's plan is that the Chinese government should take money away from the Chinese citizens and send it to America so that we can buy the products that they produce so that they can keep their jobs. Well, if the Chinese just, told us to take a hike, the Chinese could let their citizens keep their money, and now their citizens would have the jobs and their stuff because they could buy it themselves. Just having a job is no big deal. All the slaves had jobs. But they didn't get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. That's what made them slaves. Well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to enslave the Chinese and tell them you need to work so that we can consume products. That's not the way it works. We need to produce products so that we can consume them. And if we want the Chinese products, we need to make something to trade. We need to give them something of value. We just can't keep running money off a printing press and say this is an even trade. You give us all the products you make and we'll give you the money we print. And the Chinese, of course, they can't spend that money on anything. They just have to stockpile it. So I think this dynamic is coming to an end. And we saw that recently where the Federal Reserve announced that they were going to be monetizing government debt. They were going to be buying $300 billion in treasuries, and they're going to buy another $700 billion in mortgage-backed securities and some more agency debt. This is a sign that we can't sell our bonds. Because believe me, the Fed wouldn't be doing this if they didn't have to. If we could find foreign buyers, we'd sell to them. The fact that the Fed has to print money, this shows that we're nearing the end of the game. And one of the announcers on CNBC, when they first reported it, she thought that this was like a big deal. Like this is, to the Chinese, like if you don't want to buy our bonds, it's no problem. We'll print the money and buy them ourselves. Like it's the same thing. Because when we get the Chinese to buy our bonds, we export our inflation to China. Because the Chinese central bank has to print up RMB, and it uses the RMB to buy dollars, and then it takes those dollars and buys our bonds. So we don't get hit with any of the inflation. The Chinese get hit with the inflation. That's our big export. We export our inflation to China. But if the Fed prints the money and the Chinese are not involved, then we get the inflation immediately because our money supply grows. The Fed has to create money to buy those bonds. But, when governments create money, what do? I mean, they don't create any purchasing power by printing money. If that was true, if you can create purchasing power by printing money, nobody would need a job. We just all have little printing presses. So what happens when the government prints money is they reallocate purchasing power from people who have money to people who get the new money, right? Because all government is doing is debasing money. They're redistributing the purchasing power that exists. Where new purchasing power comes from is production. The only way we can buy more is if we make more. If we just print more, we can't buy anymore. All that means is we have to pay more for what we do buy. And that's what's going to happen. People make the assumption that the problem is a lack of money. We don't have enough money. And if we just had more money, we can go spend it. No. It's not that we don't have the money. We don't have the stuff. They used to make that same argument in the Soviet Union years ago. They would say that Americans, I remember watching Vladimir Putin on, I think he was on one of these interview shows, when who was the guy before Oprah Winfrey? The white-haired guy. Phil Donahue. He was on a Phil Donahue show. I remember watching this. And he basically said, he tried to describe the difference between the American economy and the Russian economy. And he said, in America, you have all this stuff. You have products on the shelves, but nobody has any money to buy. In Russia, we have a different problem. Everybody has money, but there's nothing on the shelves. And somehow he thought that our problem was worse. He thought that eventually there'd be stuff there. Well, the fact is, having money means nothing. Anybody can run, money off a printing press. You need stuff. So the reason Americans can't buy isn't because we don't have enough paper, it's because we don't have enough stuff. We need to produce more in order to consume more. Printing isn't going to do anything. But people don't think that. They think, well, if we could just have money, we can go buy stuff. And again, they think that the reason that the economy is in trouble is because people stop buying, because people stop borrowing, because people can't go out and borrow more money. That's not why we're in trouble. We're in trouble because we borrowed all the money in the first place, because we spent all the money in the first place. That's why we're in trouble. The fact that we're broke and now we can't spend any more money shouldn't surprise anybody. That's what happens when you don't save your money and you spend it all. You're broke. But if you look at what the stimulus plan is, right? What is the stimulus? What the whole basis of the stimulus is to get Americans spending. But we're broke. How are we supposed to spend? Well, the government's idea is, well, if American citizens are too broke to spend, well, we'll just spend for them. But where does the government get the money, if not from the people? So if we're broke, we can't afford all this extra government. The spending was the problem. Look at the new plan they just passed for automobiles. They just passed this the other day to give you a tax break if you go buy a new car. Why the hell would they want us to buy new cars? I mean, we're broke. You got an American that can barely afford his mortgage. He's got credit card debt, and Barack Obama wants him going out and buying a new car and taking on even more debt. I mean, how can anybody look around at the United States and say the problem in the United States economy is that we don't have enough cars? I mean, we got cars all over the place. We got too many cars. We got 2 or 3 cars per household. We don't need new cars, right? We need to make cars. We need to manufacture cars. We need to export cars. But we really don't need to buy more cars, especially if we can't afford it. Why should we be going into debt to buy cars? If we're in a problem right now because we have too much debt, how does the stimulus make the problem better? It makes it worse. Because when we finish spending all the stimulus money, now we've got the same problems, but we got more debt. Right? The solution is that we stop spending. We have to start saving. People say, but no, we can't save. They talk about this paradox of thrift, that if people start saving, then the recession is going to get worse. Well, maybe it will get worse, but the recession is the cure, remember? We need to stop spending. We need to save our money. If it means that the phony economy collapses, then that's what has to happen. We can't keep spending just to perpetuate that phony economy. We can't keep telling people they have to buy new cars just so people can have jobs working in car showrooms. Obviously, they shouldn't be there. Maybe a lot of these car dealerships need to be closed down. Bankruptcy is not a bad thing. Bankruptcy is a perfectly healthy thing for the market to do. Just like if you're sick, you have an infection in your body, the body fights it off. It doesn't help the infection. The infection wants to grow, but it's hurting the body, and the body's going to attack it. Well, when you have a corporation that's losing money, that's operating at a loss, that's like an infection on a healthy economy. We need to get rid of it. We need to cleanse it through the bankruptcy system, because what that company is doing is they're combining resources and squandering them. They're operating at a loss. The idea is to make a profit. That's how society grows, by effectively and efficiently organizing resources, which are land, labor, and capital. So if a company is making a loss, we want to get rid of it. What does the U.S. government want to do when a company is losing money? They want to subsidize it. They want to keep it in business. That doesn't make any sense at all. Because again, the government doesn't have any money. If the government's going to keep one company in business, how are they going to do that? They got to divert resources from another company. There's just an article today in the newspaper about how Berkshire Hathaway, which still has a AAA rating, is paying more to borrow money than Citigroup or than Fannie Mae. Why? Well, because the government is subsidizing these companies. So now it's more expensive for other people. And probably a lot of other people can't get credit at all because that credit is being diverted from the government to other companies that should be going bankrupt, that shouldn't even exist. But they have us believe that, no, we have to prop these companies up. The companies have to fail. That's all part of the solution. It's part of the cure. Sure, it's, when a company goes bankrupt, you can see all the people that lose their jobs. But when you prop them up, it's difficult to make the connection between somebody else that lost their job so this company can be propped up. Why do we want the government, making these decisions? Here you have, there's a big public uproar now because of the money that was given in bonuses to AIG employees, about $150 million. Meanwhile, we gave them $150 billion, $175 billion. Nobody complained about that. But the whole idea is, if we hadn't bailed AIG out, this wouldn't even be an issue because these people would be out of work. They wouldn't be getting bonuses. There'd be no money to be paid. People are talking about these contracts. There would be no contracts. The company would be in bankruptcy. But first the government gives them all the money, and now we're upset at what they do with it. What do we expect? Right? I mean, it's like, if you give your teenage kid, car keys and alcohol, and then he crashes the car, you're going to, what do you expect is going to happen? You don't think these guys are going to pay out some of the money that they got to themselves in bonuses, the salary? What do you think they're going to do with it? But if we were concerned, we shouldn't have given them money in the first place. But according to the government, it's always 2 wrongs make a right. They do one thing wrong, and now they have to do something else wrong. They try to pass this tax to tax the bonuses at 90%, and that creates a terrible precedent of illegal taxing power for the government. They usurp more power. But what's happening? So in addition to the stimulus plans and the bailouts, which are all interfering, right? In order to cure our economy, certain companies need to go bankrupt so that other companies can form. People have to lose jobs so they can get other jobs. And we have to stop spending so we can start saving. If we're going to have factories, if we're going to produce stuff, we need capital. Capital comes from savings and under consumption. So what is the government doing? They're interfering with that process. They're building roadblocks. They're preventing the cure from working, and they're making sure the disease gets worse. But at the same time, they're socializing the economy. They're blaming the problems on capitalism, and they're coming up with big government solutions to problems that were created by government. But now we're making our economy even less efficient. If the government is now running the banking industry, they're running the automobile industry, they're running the insurance industries, they're running all these industries, they're micromanaging, right? It's central government planning. It's not going to work. We can't allocate resources based on politicians trying to get elected or trying to get votes. We need resources allocated by entrepreneurs trying to make a profit. You know, we need to be led by the invisible hand of the market, not the clumsy hand of the state. I mean, look, there was just in the news that I think the post office reported losses of $7 or $8 billion, and they want to eliminate Saturday mail delivery. The post office has been around for, I don't know how many 100 years or whatever, plus years, and they still can't make a profit. The government can't even deliver the mail and make a profit. How are they going to run AIG or any of these industries? It's lunacy. And here you have Barack Obama. He's talking about the businesses of the future. There's certain industries that he wants to fund, right? How does he know? How does he know what industries to fund? If he was that smart, if he was such a great entrepreneur that he knew exactly what would work, why wasn't he a billionaire? Why is he in politics? Why did he go into government if he knows exactly what products industries should be making? If he can predict in advance, No. Do you think, if the government tried to come up with Google, that somebody in the government would have said, we need Google, and we would have had it? Or search engine? No, none of the innovations come from a government decree. The government doesn't know anything. And there's no checks and balances if the government is wrong, right? If a private entrepreneur makes a mistake, he goes bankrupt. The losses are cut. If he bets wrong, he loses. If the government bets wrong, they just get bigger. They just appropriate more money. It's a bottomless pit because they either get it from the taxpayers or they run it off a printing press. So when private industry makes a mistake, it's corrected and it goes away. As governments make mistakes, they get bigger and bigger and bigger and make more and more and more. Because as they run out of money, they just ask for more. And so you get rewarded for making mistakes. In the meantime, that's exactly what we're doing by subsidizing companies that should be failing, right? We've got a reverse Darwinism. We've got survival of the unfittest. The companies people that have made terrible mistakes are being rewarded. And other people are being punished or taxed. I own a small brokerage firm, Euro Pacific Capital. I don't have any debt. I don't have any toxic assets on my balance sheet. I didn't get all leveraged up. I'm in perfect position, as well as a lot of other small companies that had the good sense not to drink the Fed's alcohol, that acted responsibly. Why aren't we able to come in and pick up the pieces? Why can't we hire a lot of these Wall Street guys away from the firms who made all the mistakes? Well, one of the reasons that we can't is because the government is now subsidizing those companies so they can pay these big retention bonuses to keep their people. Why? Let the companies fail. Do you think there wouldn't be any investment banking if Goldman or Morgan went out of business? Do you think there'd be no brokerage? Do you think we need these gigantic companies? We need them like a hole in the head. Let them fail. The government is making this big deal. Companies are too big to fail. No, they're not. If they're that big and they're that dumb, let them go out of business. They say, the consequences are so horrific. How do we know? Let's see. They're trying to blame this entire collapse on the fact that they let Lehman Brothers fail. And I find that hard to believe. Because look at all the companies we didn't let fail. Look at all the companies we bailed out. Maybe it's because of those bailouts. Maybe letting Lehman Brothers fail was the one thing we did right. But of course, that's the one thing that they don't want to repeat because the government wants to get bigger. They don't want to waste this crisis. The Obama administration sees an opportunity to get bigger, to say the government's going to ride to the rescue and save the economy. And that's the problem. We can't afford that rescue. Because when they come to the rescue of the economy, what are they doing? They're going to impede the recovery, they're going to make us less productive, and they're going to make the problems worse. And that's the self-perpetuating spiral. The more the government intervenes, the worse the economy gets, the more they're called on to solve the problem, and the bigger they get. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. Every time you throw gasoline, the fire gets bigger. But you can't, you don't make the connection between the gasoline and the bigger fire. So you keep reaching for more gasoline every time the fire gets bigger. And then you get a raging inferno. But unfortunately, that's the only way the government knows how to put out a fire, is by pouring on gasoline. What we got to do is stop. Unfortunately, there's only one real solution to the problem. And it's the one solution that we're not going to adopt. And that's let the market function. Let the recession run its course. Let companies go bankrupt. Let Americans stop spending. Let them start saving. Take the recession and deal with the consequences right now. The one thing the government could do, if it really wanted to help, would be to shrink, because the government is a burden on the economy. We have to produce enough to support the government. Right? The government doesn't produce anything. So we have to be productive enough to support them. And if, in good times, maybe you can afford a lot of government. It does damage, but maybe you can afford it. We certainly can't afford it now. So we need smaller government. We need the government to contract, to stop spending money on the military, to spend less domestically, to actually abolish entire departments, to shrink. And if it shrinks enough, it could deliver real tax cuts to the American people, which we probably need. I think we desperately need. But we can't pretend to give people tax cuts. If we just cut their taxes, but the government keeps right on spending, then the cost of government is still there. Because the cost of government is not what it taxes, but what it spends. And if it doesn't take us from us in taxation, it's going to take us through inflation, right? It's just going to print money. And if we print money and spend it, we're not getting all that government for free. The government is robbing us of our savings. It's robbing us of our investments. It's robbing us of our wages. It's stealing the purchasing power out from under us and then giving it back selectively. And we're all getting poorer. So the consequence of what the government is doing, as I said, I think is going to be the real economic collapse. I think what's going to happen over the next several years is the foreigners who have been lending us money, who have been buying up our debt, are going to stop doing it. And more of our debt's going to be monetized. And as that starts to happen, prices are really going to start to rise. In the short run, we haven't seen consumer prices rising that much. Why haven't they risen? Well, we've had forces that have been pushing them down. We've had bankruptcies, we've had going out of business sales, liquidation, deleveraging. All these things have been suppressing prices. At the same time, the government inflation, which is the creation of money, has been pushing prices up. It's like if somebody is, eating a high-carb diet, but they're constantly exercising, they don't gain any weight. They kind of have two forces that are working in equilibrium. Well, if they stop exercising and keep eating, well, then they're going to get fat. And the same thing is going to happen in the U.S. The forces that are pushing prices down are temporary. Eventually, the companies that are going out of business, they're out of business. Eventually, the companies that had excess inventory and they slashed prices to get rid of it, the inventory is gone. The deleveraging is going to run its course. The dollar is going to stop strengthening and start falling. It was the strengthening dollar that temporarily kept our prices down. When the dollar resumes its descent, that will be pushing upward pressure on prices. So prices are going to start to rise. As prices start to rise, I don't know if the government's going to pick it up in its CPI. I guess the CPI is so manipulated. But people are going to start to notice it. And as prices start to rise, lenders want higher interest rates because now they're afraid of inflation. I mean, over the last 6 months, people have been afraid of owning assets. They've wanted safety. They're risk averse. They've been moving to the perceived safety of cash. But once they realize that there's no safety in cash, particularly the dollar, once they realize that the dollar is being inflated, they're not going to want cash. They're going to want to get out of cash. They're going to want stuff. And if they're going to want cash, they're going to want to be paid a very high rate of interest to hold that cash. In 1980, when Volcker first came in, and we tried to clean up the mess of the Great Society and Nixon and Jimmy Carter, he had to put interest rates up to 20% to convince people to hold on to our bonds. It's not like, when Volcker came in and he tried to figure out, what would be a good interest rate for everybody. what would help out the economy, and he picked 20%. He did that because he had to. He had to convince creditors to hold on to this debt because they knew how high inflation was, and he had to be serious. So the same thing's going to happen. Our creditors are going to want more and more interest, but we're not going to be able to pay it. We are so leveraged up at this point. Americans are so deeply indebted, and the government itself, we've got an $11 trillion national debt right now. We didn't have that in 1980. And of course, the national debt is financed with T-bills. A third of the national debt comes due in the next year. Back in 1980, the national debt was all 30-year government bonds. So when interest rates went up to 20%, it only affected the money the government borrowed that year and a small amount of debt that was maturing. But today, if interest rates went up to 10% or more, it would affect the entire national debt. Well, where are we going to get the money to make interest payments on this national debt? It's just a gigantic adjustable rate mortgage. It's the same as individuals. We're on the teaser rate right now. We got a teaser rate. When that teaser rate expires and it resets, we've got a default. Just like Americans, we're going to need to modify the debt or get an interest rate reduction or a cram down or something. But the U.S. government's probably not going to have the integrity to default in an honest manner. So as the world doesn't want to buy the debt, or Americans don't want to buy the debt because the interest isn't high enough to offset for the lost purchasing power, then the monetization really begins to kick in because more and more of the debt is bought by the Treasury. And of course, the more of our debt the Treasury buys, the less it's worth because every time the Fed buys our debt, it prints the money to do it. And therefore, if you don't sell, you're going to take a loss. So it creates a self-perpetuating spiral, whereas the Fed is printing money to buy bonds. Everybody wants to sell their bonds to the Fed because no one wants to be left holding the bag. And so you get this spiral, and then prices are going to start to run out of control. And I think what's going to happen sometime before the end of the Obama term is that we're going to have price controls in this country. We're going to have price controls on food products. We're going to have price controls on energy. And what's that going to do? That's going to create shortages. That's going to create long lines. That's going to create black markets. That's going to create a whole new class of criminals. Because obviously, if you deal in the black market, you're a criminal. The government's going to usurp all sorts of new powers. We're probably going to have exchange controls. A lot of bad things are going to happen. A lot of more power is going to be grabbed by the government as it does more and more damage. So anybody who thinks that this is the economic collapse, no. I mean, this is the overture. We still have the opera. Anyway, okay, let me stop now and take questions. Are there any questions? Yeah.
The more in a recession now, and he seemed so positive about everything. It just seemed so sort of counterproductive.
Yeah, well, Kramer is clueless. He doesn't know anything about economics. I mean, he doesn't understand. I mean, he thinks it's all about printing money. He thinks that the Fed can save the day. He's saying in Bernanke we trust. Right. He thinks that what Bernanke is doing is going to work. Well, why didn't it work in Zimbabwe then? We're doing the same thing. Any other questions?
Do you guys want to come up to the mic?
Okay.
Raise your hand first.
So then what's your advice for the few of us who are responsible and have zero debt so that we don't get killed by the inflation?
Yeah, well, you're the patsies in this whole thing. I mean, people who did the right thing, who saved their money, you're going to be asked to fund all the stimuluses. You're going to be stuck with the bill because it's your savings that are going to get inflated away. And that was the whole premise of the investment advice of my book, to understand that the riskiest asset to own is U.S. currency or U.S. dollar-denominated assets because your interests are going to be sacrificed because the creditors are in the minority. The debtors have all the votes. In fact, a lot of the creditors don't have any vote. They're not even American. So obviously, it's the creditors who are going to be sacrificed, especially since the U.S. government is the biggest debtor of us all. And so inflation is their only solution. And inflation is the enemy of anybody who has treasuries or muni bonds or bank accounts. And so forget about the fact that the government says, oh, don't worry, your accounts are insured by the FDIC. The insurance is meaningless. All they insure to do is give you your money, but they don't insure that your money is going to have any value. In fact, they practically insure that it won't have any value. If they have to print all the money to make good all these promises, it won't have value. So the solution, unfortunately, is you got to get out of the dollar. And that further undermines our economy. We need Americans to save their money in the U.S. so that it can be invested in the U.S. But unfortunately, the policies that we're pursuing are destructive to savings. They discourage savings, and they force savers to flee. But that's what we have to do, because otherwise your savings will get wiped out. So you need to invest abroad, you need to own foreign currencies, foreign stocks, precious metals, and hopefully one day when this insanity stops and we can finally begin to address these problems, you can bring that money back and help invest in building the economy of the future.
There's a group of people out there that agree with your overall diagnostic, but they question your prediction of hyperinflation. Their argument is that the credit destruction that's happening right now is so large that doesn't matter how much money the government print, it's still a drop in the bucket. And they mention, as an example, the case of Japan in the 80s, where they run very large deficits. It failed as a policy, but they never saw hyperinflation. How do you respond to that?
Well, they didn't run them to the size that we're going to. But the difference between Japan and the United States is Japan was a very productive economy. Japan had a high savings rate, and they were the world's largest trade surplus. So the Japanese were very competitive. They had a bubble. Had the government not interfered, prices, consumer prices, based on how efficient the Japanese economy was, we would have seen a rather substantial decline in consumer prices over that decade. The fact that that did not happen was a result of all the inflation that the Bank of Japan created. But just because prices didn't drop by 5% a year, instead they were flat, that doesn't mean there wasn't inflation. The inflation was the difference between the decline and prices being flat. So Japanese citizens were still robbed of the benefit of lower prices. The government still interfered with the economic rebalancing that was going to take place. The Japanese had a bubble in stocks and real estate for the same reason that we had a bubble. In the 80s, they kept their interest rates too low. And you know why they did that? To prop up the dollar. To keep the dollar from falling, they kept their rates low to make the yen less attractive. They wanted to maintain the American market for their exports. They are making the same mistake that the Chinese have been making. They're trying to preserve a market that's not worth preserving because we can't pay for anything. It's a perpetual vendor financing. And if you have to give your customers money to buy your product, then you need new customers. And to say that just because credit is being destroyed, you can't have hyperinflation, that's just not true. You have to also look at the velocity of money. You have to look at all the dollars around the world. And as our economy starts to contract, people aren't going to want to own our money. And they're not going to want to hold it. If people are willing to store money and not spend it, then prices won't start to spiral. But the minute all of our creditors, the minute the Chinese and the Japanese and the Saudis want out of their dollars, want to start spending their dollars, prices have to go through the roof because the money is coming back to our shores, bidding up prices. And then the government has to print even more money to deal with the consequences. It has nothing to do with the fact that a loan has gone bad. Just because, if I loan somebody money and they don't pay me back, the money isn't necessarily, I've lost it as a creditor, but the money the debtor still ended up spending the money. If you could simply, that argument is, we don't have to worry about bad loans. Because if we ever make a bad loan, the government can just print the money and pay it off, and it's like no damage has been done. But a lot of damage has been done. And that new money that's printed is not creating any purchasing power. There's no production associated with it. So all it can do is create inflation.
Hi, I have a question for Mountain View. Is oil a risky commodity to own since we are the biggest consumers and loss of our purchasing power means low demand?
Well, I think oil prices are going to go a lot higher. And I think ultimately, as the dollar collapses, Americans are going to consume a lot less oil. There's no question about that. We're going to demand a lot less. But the world is going to demand a lot more. Because as the dollar loses value, other currencies are gaining value. So as oil is becoming more expensive for Americans, it's becoming cheaper for somebody else. And so as we reduce our consumption, as we get priced out of the market, others consume more as they get priced in. So that's what's going to happen. So just because we consume less doesn't mean the prices are going to drop. On the contrary, I think prices are going to go up. I think they're going to go up spectacularly. I think oil prices are going to be a lot higher by the time Obama leaves office than they were at the peak before he came into office.
Thanks very much for coming in, Mr. Schiff. It was really interesting hearing you talk. One thing you mentioned was the fact that when we bailed out Lehman Brothers, you thought that was when we didn't bail out Lehman Brothers, you thought that was something that we should try more of. That in fact, right after that, we did a lot of bailouts, and that potentially caused a detrimental effect. One
Well,
thing
we also bailed out Bear before Lehman.
That's
I mean, we took a lot of bad debt off of Bear's books
Right.
and put it on the Fed.
So one thing we did see right after the bailout of Lehman, where Lehman went to bankruptcy, was a real spike in the rate that banks used to lend to each other. Basically, banks became very, very afraid to do any sort of lending at all, and the credit market overall freezed up. And the only time when we saw that go away was when we did see more governmental intervention since then, when we started bailing out companies. That credit
we
rate,
put a Band-Aid on the problem, but the problem is still getting worse. I mean, we want credit to be allocated efficiently. We don't want government coming in and saying, don't worry about lending money, because if it's a bad debt, we'll pay you off. Because credit needs to be allocated based on free market principles. And if I'm afraid to lend somebody money, then there's probably a good reason for that. Maybe they can't pay me back. Maybe that individual or that entity shouldn't be able to borrow money. But when the government comes in and says, we guarantee their debt, now non-credit-worthy institutions are able to get credit. And now somebody else who's not getting a government guarantee is denied credit, because credit is scarce. Credit flows from savings. There's not an unlimited supply of it.
Sorry, my question, I guess, is, do you think that banks who do the lending are intelligent enough to be able to distinguish between the entrepreneurs who you do want to be able to be creative and invest in them and take the risk on them, but still, be able to be risk averse when it comes to
well, that's look. I think that
lending?
Banks are going to be better judges of lending money than the government. The government's just guaranteeing debt for political reasons. I mean, one of the reasons that the banks, of course, were so reckless with their money is because of the FDIC. I mean, we set up a situation of moral hazard where we basically told American citizens, just put your money in any bank, and who cares what they do with your money, because if they lose it on stupid loans, the FDIC will bail you out. Therefore, the bankers know that they're not competing based on how safe their institution is. They're competing on what kind of yield they can pay. And so they're prone to risk-taking. But there's enough. If the government would really let people know, look, the FDIC limit is only $100,000. If you have a lot more than that, then you're on your own. I mean, the banks are still going to have to worry about large deposits. But we need the lenders of money to determine creditworthiness and determine who they want to lend to and on what terms they want to offer that credit. Because that's the only way we can judge it. People that are riskier borrowers either won't get credit or will have to pay a higher price for it.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And I know that obviously not bailing companies out and letting them fail, there's a lot of problems. I mean, there's a lot of immediate pain. That's why the government is doing the bailouts. But my point is not that there's no pain and there's no consequences. It's just that we're better off dealing with those consequences now, taking the pain now, rather than postponing it and making it worse. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. You can just rip it off or you can peel it off slowly. And generally, if you just rip it off, you're better off.
Hi. Two questions. One, given, your concern with the size of the federal government, do you think there is any sort of political movement that is capable of taking power and doing the right thing? And do you think the political environment and just the overall political process in Washington is even capable of reversing it, whether or not the people in power, have the right intentions? And two, quickly, the government's plan to buy up the toxic assets by lending money to private investors. There seems to be a lot of backlash against it. Win, you win, lose, the taxpayers lose. And without knowing too much about what sort of investments you do, do you have any interest in that, or is that?
No, I wouldn't be interested in buying any of those toxic assets. I'm sure that
even with free money.
Well, no, it's not free. You still have to put something up, and I think that money is going to be lost. I think Wall Street's going to make out on this deal because they're going to get management fees. They're going to manage these pools of money. Some of it is government money, and some of it might be their clients' money. But Wall Street doesn't generally do a pretty good job with their clients' money. But I don't know if they're going to put their own funds there. I mean, I think they're smart enough to realize that they're likely to overpay for these assets, assuming that they're able to pay them. And of course, now they just made the assets more expensive because now the government is saying you don't have to mark your toxic assets to market anymore. You can just pretend that they're worth more than they are. So I mean, and this whole thing about saying that they're trying to claim that if a mortgage is current, then we should value it based on its cash flow, and not take a realistic view of how likely that cash flow is in the future. I mean, if there's a mortgage now that's current, and the mortgage is $500,000, and the condo is worth $300,000, Why should I assume that that mortgage is going to be paid off? There's a good chance that the person making the mortgage is going to wake up one day and say, why am I wasting all this money? Either they're going to lose their job, or their teaser rate's going to reset, or they're just going to come to the reality and say, wait a minute, why am I sending this, $3,000 a month mortgage payment in when I can rent the house next door for $1,500 a month? What's the point? I mean, so right now people are realistically assessing. I mean, obviously to say that these mortgages are illiquid, they're not illiquid. It's not liquidity they lack, it's value. I mean, to say there's no buyers, sure there's buyers at a certain price. I mean, it's a bond. A mortgage is like a bond. And people could say, look, here's a mortgage, here's the cash flow. I mean, here's a pool of them. What do you want to pay? I mean, there are people with savings. It's not that there's nobody that wants to buy them. The reason that people don't want to pay high prices is because they're not stupid. They know that they're not worth that. So this whole thing is an illusion. But as far as your initial question on the politics, I don't think there's any political will right now. As long as the Chinese and the Japanese will keep lending us money and supporting the growth of our government, then there's no reason for us to have to deal with any difficult choices. What we need is for the rest of the world to cut us off. So now we have to deal with the consequences. And now maybe there will be some political will. When the choices are between hyperinflation or cutting government, then maybe we'll do the right thing. Maybe when our back is to the wall. I mean, there certainly are enough people that know the truth. The problem is there's a lot of people that get a check for the government. But I guess when they realize that those checks aren't going to buy anything, it's like, sure, I can keep giving you your Social Security checks, but it's not. What good is it if there's no value there? And I know at least we got the internet now. At least we have a way to get alternate ideas out to people. We don't have to rely on filtering them through the major media outlets, that we can go direct to the people. People can find out alternative information and pass it along. I know there are a lot of young people that follow me. I mean, obviously they're not investors, so they're not following me because of they want to be clients. They're obviously listening to what I'm saying from a political point of view, from an economic point of view. I get emails every day from high school kids, not only in America but all around the world, who are following me. College kids, young adults. So I know there are people out there that are getting this information. Look at all the support Ron Paul had from young people. So I mean, there's hope.
Okay, thank you.
From the talk that you just gave, I think one of your primary concerns is the hyperinflation. So that said, isn't having at least controlled rate of inflation actually good for the economy as a whole? I mean, our stock market is reset, so they're at a more fair value now. So same goes with the real estate market. What didn't really happen is, in general, the market's operating costs, meaning the entire, the collection of the companies, which also includes the salaries as well. So having inflation reset the value of those operating costs, wouldn't that make the economy in general more competitive?
Well, I mean, we want to move away from governments trying to determine an inflation rate and make sure that we have it or manage. Mm-hmm. The best thing to do is have real money, to have money with intrinsic value, to have gold as money, and just allow prices to adjust and and let the market set interest rates, not the government. And when you have sound money, when you have a real money as opposed to a government-created money, the natural tendency of prices, we know from history, is to fall. Prices decline a little bit every year, and that's how society becomes wealthier, because our money gains value, we gain purchasing power. I mean, you can see that, certainly in the high-tech area. You can see what happens to cell phones and plasma TVs and laptop computers, digital cameras. All these prices are falling. That's what happens in a free market. It would happen with other things. It would happen with education. It would happen with healthcare. It would happen with food. It would happen with energy. It would happen with all these products if the government stopped creating inflation. It's just that there's so much efficiencies and productivities in the technology area that prices are falling despite all that inflation. But the government always tries to make the argument that we need inflation. If we have falling prices, that nobody will buy anything, that the economies will grind to a halt, that businesses can't make a profit. That's all nonsense. Do you think people don't buy cell phones? Do people not buy plasma TVs? Everybody knows when you buy a plasma TV, if you just wait 6 months or a year, you'll get it cheaper. But people don't wait. They buy it when they want it. Now, there are some people who didn't buy them when they were $10,000 a piece because they were too much money. So they waited until they could afford it. But as companies gain economies of scale and they get more efficient, prices fall and people buy more things. Plus, even though the plasma TVs are not $10,000 a piece anymore, I bet that companies are making a lot more money selling plasma TVs at $1,000 than when they were selling with $10,000, because they're selling more of them. And that's what counts for profitability. You know, it's you can multiply it with volume. So the argument that governments need to protect us from falling prices, that we need inflation, is all nonsense. It's all self-serving. The government needs inflation, not us. And the reason the government needs inflation is because that means they can play Santa Claus. That means they can print money and spend it. That means they don't have to tax us for all the government programs. They can pretend that there's no cost. And the government has a lot of debt. The government wants to wipe out its debt. So the government wants inflation, and it finds a way to justify it so it can cram it down our throats.
All right, unfortunately, that'll be very quick.
Maybe something positive. So I was just hoping maybe you could give some advice to the people in this room who care about their, finances looking forward. Where would you put your money if you had a horizon? You mentioned precious metals. We know gold is anti-inflationary, and tips maybe in bonds. But any suggestions, for the people in this room, and say, where can I put my money so that it's not just sitting in a checking
if you want to make more traditional investments, I think foreign stocks are the best place to go. I think valuations in many stocks around the world are extremely low right now. I mean, not here in America, but in other parts of the world. You can buy assets really at fire sale prices. You can get tremendous dividend yields. I think you really want to invest for the future and look at what's happening right now is really a changing of the economic guard. I think, the Asian economies, China in particular, this is the future. This is where all the productivity is. This is where everything is being made. This is where all the surpluses are being accumulated. This area of the world is going to grow, and there's going to be a major transition of wealth and purchasing power away from America to the Asian economies. And it's going to happen from a realignment of exchange rates and a reevaluation of assets. And you want to position your personal investments to be on the winning end of that transformation. So there are plenty of great stocks you can buy in Singapore, you can buy in Hong Kong, you can buy in Japan that really feed into the Chinese economy, that are going to benefit from the added wealth and added purchasing power of the Chinese as they go more from exporting their production to consuming their production themselves and trading more with nations that can actually afford to buy their products instead of countries where they have to lend them the money. And to the extent that the Chinese keep more of their savings themselves, they have more savings to invest productively. They can build even more factories. They can be even more productive. When they take their savings and just give them to us and we squander it on consumption, it's not doing them any good. So you want to be in a position that your investments will reflect that and that you can benefit from that.
And on the precious metal side?
Yeah, you just want to buy. I think silver's looks really good here. It's around $13, $14 an ounce. It got as high as $20 an ounce last year. I think it's going a lot higher. Gold, once gold breaks through 1,000, I think it's going a lot higher. And when the Chinese or the Russians are talking about trying to find an alternative to the dollar, they're talking about maybe using these special drawing rights from the IMF. That's not going to fly. That's not going to help. Ultimately, the real solution is gold. And that's ultimately what's going to happen. The only reason that the dollar is the reserve currency was because when it became the reserve currency, not only was it backed by gold, but it was redeemable in gold on demand. If it wasn't for that feature, it never would have been accepted as the reserve currency. The reason currencies have reserves is so they have value. You have to back your currency with something. Backing it by the dollar is like backing it with nothing because there's nothing backing the dollar. So I think what's going to happen is the world's going to realize the real fault of the problems, and the reason we have all these imbalances is because we have no money. We're on this phony system, this phony fiat system that doesn't work, that creates the imbalances, that creates the booms and busts. We need real money. We need to depoliticize money, and we need gold. And I think that's going to happen. And when nations start to reaccumulate gold, when central banks become buyers of gold and not sellers of gold, prices are going to go way up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schiff. We appreciate it.
Sure.